In continuing with our discussion of Lacan's re-theorization, re-articulation of Freud's notion of the death drive, we are going to use a couple of illustrative examples, and we're going to continue with our description of all the ways in which the Lacanian reconceptualization of the death drive, in a way, flies in the face of many of the notions that we've had about what death drive actually is. And what we're going to talk a little bit about today is why death drive should not, in Lacan's view, be reduced to a notion like Thanatos. Why it shouldn't be seen as an opposition between Eros, some kind of life force, and Thanatos, some kind of deathly force, some kind of deathly substance. Hence, I've subtitled this talk, Death is Not a Thing. So let's begin then, and I'm going to start with a quote that ends Karl Ove Knausgård's book, A Death in the Family. I'm going to start with in fact, it's the last couple of lines of this book, which is all about Karl Ove Knausgård's father dying. And I just want to highlight one way that he talks about death, which will become useful as we move on and defy or refute this idea of death as Thanatos. So, last couple of lines. Death, says Karl Ove Knausgård, this is page 393, death, which I've always regarded as the greatest dimension of life, dark, compelling, was no more than a pipe that springs a leak, a branch that cracks in the wind, a jacket that slips off a clothes hanger and falls to the floor. So a succession of three images there. A pipe that springs a leak, a branch that cracks in the wind, a jacket that slips off a clothes hanger and falls to the floor. We'll come back to that. So, what are some of the reasons that, particularly for Zizek, in his introduction and his discussion of these Lacanian concepts, that death drive should not be reduced to Thanatos? Well, we could say that there's at least two. The first of these would simply be the idea that in thinking about death drive as something that opposes Eros, that opposes a life force, we end up with this rather clunky dualistic theory, which sounds a little bit Star Wars, right? Like, the dark side, the light side. And in a way, just at a very meta-theoretical level, this doesn't fit very well within the Lacanian universe of conceptualization. I mean, there's a reason you could say why Lacan doesn't have two orders, but three orders. There's an imaginary, there's a symbolic, and there's the real. And that sounds a little bit yin-yang, a little bit cosmic harmonish. That's not going to work very well in a kind of Lacanian world. We'll build on that in a moment, but just to highlight for a start that this kind of dualistic conceptualization is seemingly problematic. And one way that it seems to be problematic for Lacan is that if you've got two, and the whole idea with yin and yang, two opposing forces, that seems to imply that you could attain some kind of balance, right? Isn't a balance, after all, precisely a balance between two countervailing weights? So this isn't really going to work for Lacan, and here comes then the first argument that Zizek via Lacan will make. Death drive is not a kind of negativity, a kind of deathliness which opposes itself to life, because otherwise you could have some kind of harmony. Rather, you could say that death drive is the inherent blockage of drive itself. So in the weird world of Lacanian mathematics, you could say, rather than having one opposed to another, you wouldn't have this balance between one and another. Rather, you would look into the singular fact of what we could call death drive itself, and find that death drive itself is there in fact as a function of the inner impossibility of the drive itself. So that's one argument. For the second argument against Thanatos, we could say that one of the crucial elements of this argument is that Lacan, in many facets of his work, is highly suspicious when we start to substantialize certain concepts. He particularly doesn't like the idea that ego, id, superego become little agencies, little substantialized entities within the human psychical functioning. And you could also say that death drive, and this is particularly evident in how Slavoj Zizek uses a whole series of Hegelian phrases to think about the death drive. Death drive is not a substance as such. It's not a thing. Death is not a thing. And I try to allude a little bit to that in some of the Karl Ove Knausgård quotes that we began with. But if we're going to develop that in a little bit of a more philosophical way, the idea here being that rather than ontologize death, give death a kind of status as a thing, as an entity of sorts, that we could use not just Zizek's Lacanian conceptualization, but in a very interesting move, Slavoj Zizek cites Jonathan Lear, the well-known American psychoanalyst and scholar, who, interestingly, although not Lacanian in any ways, also has an argument against why there seems to be a problem with substantializing, ontologizing the death drive. So I'm going to read a little quote, another book. This is Slavoj Zizek's 2004 book called Absolute Recoil. And I'm going to read a brief description here where this argument, which I'm calling the move to desubstantialize death drive, the move to deontologize death drive, is made by Zizek, and also here we'll see how Zizek cites Jonathan Lear to make that point. Jonathan Lear has demonstrated, we're on page 122, Jonathan Lear has demonstrated how Freud's turn to Eros and Thanatos as two basic polar forces of the universe is a false escape, a pseudo-explanation. After establishing the pleasure principle as that which defines the functioning of the psychic apparatus, Freud is compelled to take note of the phenomena, primarily repetitions of traumatic experience, which disrupt this functioning. They form an exception which cannot be accounted for in terms of the pleasure principle. Okay, in that quote. All right, so we could say that for a large proportion of psychical functions, human psychology, you could say that the pleasure principle is a crucial explanatory element. But it appears that it's not always the only explanation for what's at work. There seem to be certain kinds of exceptions to this explanation. Okay, not rocket science. We're still with Jonathan Lear and Slavoj Zizek. However, we can suggest, and here's Jonathan Lear's point, the various psychical apparatus operations, the various facets of human psychology have the propensity for disruption. And more than that, they can disrupt their own functions. Now, instead of trying to conceptualize this break, this negativity, this self-disruption that occurs within the mind as a kind of inherent negativity, Freud, says Lear and Zizek, wants to ground this disruption in another deeper positivity. In other words, you could say that what he's doing is trying to find an explanation, almost a kind of ontological account of why deathliness or these disruptions are given a kind of agentic agency, and not just an agency, but are given a kind of substance, a kind of thingness, a kind of positivity, which he wants to now name and highlight and say that is death drive. So let me give an example of my attempt to try and understand this. In the 1990s, I used to collect a whole bunch of CDs. I was a big music fan. And around in the 1990s, after collecting CDs for a couple of years, more than a couple of years, and spending a lot of money on them, I gleefully realized you could get software that would enable you to copy CDs on your computer. So of course I loved this. I borrowed a ton of CDs from friends and I started copying CDs. Now the problem was some of the software I got wasn't so good. In fact, it was probably pirated now that I think about it, but some of the software wasn't so good. So what would happen in my attempt to copy the music was not all the data would be copied. So I'd be at work listening to a copied CD and I would hear the song, but then there'd be this tick, 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 tick in the recording. Now I hear that as a presence, a tick, 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 as a thingness, okay, as something that's intruding upon, blotting out my music. But you could say that it's not so much that that's an excess, that's a thing, rather it's the fact that the data wasn't properly copied. There was a problem within the copying software, so not all the music was copied. And what I was hearing was a gap. I was hearing a negativity. But the way I heard it was as a kind of disruption, as a kind of mark on top of the music. And I think we start to see that kind of idea also in the Karl Ove Knausgård. Death is a branch that breaks, a pipe that springs a leak. It's almost as if we're so keen to try to understand death or negativity or an error or disruption that we give it a persona. And that, in a way, you could say is the error. It's not that you need a persona for a pipe to spring a leak. You don't need a persona or a grim reaper for a branch to break in the wind. Rather, those are inherent capacities of the thing itself which happen. But what is the kind of optical illusion here, and I've tried to put it on the board by saying, the optical illusion here is that human propensity to see something that disrupts my life or my prospective immortality, because in some ways, unconsciously, presumably, we think we're going to live forever. We see that as some kind of intruding force, when it's not so much an intruding force, it's just the inherent failure that's built within the thing itself. So here's the quote: death drive, in a way, is the optical illusion of a human perspective on our expectations that things will be complete, that they will be consistent, that we might live forever. So on the kind of abiding presumption that we'll have a non-systems failure. So it's odd that you could say that in many instances when something breaks down, when the branch breaks in the wind, the pipe springs a leak, we see that as some kind of embodied negativity happening to the thing. Why is this happening to me? When in fact it's not that positive intrusion of something, but rather the inherent incapacity of that thing itself. Okay, so those are a series of ideas to try to, as it were, desubstantialize death drive. Rather than see death drive as this thingness, we could say that it is, and some of Zizek's Hegelian vocabulary, I think, helps us here. He uses a whole series of Hegelian terms, and we will return to them and try to explain them in a little bit more detail as we go on. But the two that are nice here, constitutive gap and negative inherence. I particularly like negative inherence. They seem to apply nicely to those examples that I've looked at. We've just got to finish our quote though. So going back to absolute recoil, now we're on 1, 2, 3. Back to Zizek. This move in Freud to think about the attempt to highlight libido as eros as opposed to death drive. This may seem a radicalization, says Zizek, but it is effectively a kind of philosophical domestication. The break that disrupts the functioning of the universe, its ontological fault, as it were, is transformed into two positive cosmic principles, thus re-establishing a pacifying, harmonious vision of the universe as a battlefield of two opposing principles. And of course, you could see that Zizek and Lacan is opposed to this. And we could even do a kind of shout out to much later Lacan. Lacanians are always forever repeating this idea, there is no sexual relationship. Of course, we could spend a lot of time wondering exactly all of the implications and resonances that this mantra has, but one of them is, I think, is that both clinically and more broadly, maybe philosophically, you could say that Lacanians are wary of the notion of harmony, because the notion of harmony is often a phantasmatic projection, a fantasy placed over a hopeful wishfulness, which covers over the fact that, in fact, you could say that reality itself is not consistent or not coherent. Or another way of putting it is, this analytical mantra, there is no sexual relationship for Lacanians, is one way of directing attention to how there might be conflict, or there probably is conflict within any relationship, within any kind of system. And I think it applies nicely here too, to the notion of the death drive. So we're going to make one more point, and then we want to end with a question. We've said that one of the reasons that we don't want Thanatos anymore in the Lacanian universe is that we don't have two opposed forces. This seems to imply too much of a harmony, too much of a yin and yang, too much of a counterbalance, when in fact what one should look for as a Lacanian is more the propensity, the inherent instabilities, the constitutive gaps or the negative inherences in those facets of psychological reality that we wish were more harmonized. But this point is also important to develop in another way. It's not simply that we're opposed to the notions of harmony, but also because one wants to draw attention to how drive phenomena in and of themselves have a kind of negative inherence. That drive in and of itself is characterized by a kind of impossibility, is characterized by a kind of fraughtness. So as I put it here, the death drive's own inner impossibility is what we see in this notion of the inherent self-blockage of the drive. This, I think, is crucial because it alerts us to the fact that if we're going to properly understand death drive, we're going to need to understand what drive itself is. And this is something we'll go on to in some subsequent lectures. But death drive, you could say, is the fruition, in an odd kind of way, of the inherent impossibility, the inherent instability of drive phenomena in and of themselves. Drive phenomena which always seem to have that excess, which push to a too muchness, which in itself could be said to have a kind of deathly inherence. So let's end then with two questions. Number one, why is it that for Lacan all drives are potentially death drives? This flies very much in the face of a series of Freudian conceptualizations. Why can we say that all drives are potentially death drives? That's our first question. And then our second question, which starts to be a slightly nagging issue for us. We have in Freud a sense, and I'll try to put this question down here on the board, the kind of hold on moment. The hold on moment is, we could say that in Freud we often see death drive thought as a kind of surplus, as a kind of excess, as a kind of problematic, excessive agency, as a kind of psychological entity. But in the types of more philosophical theorization that we've just looked at here via Zizek, we see death drive less as a psychological propensity, a kind of agency or a kind of excess. We see it more, and in my examples that I've given, we see death here more as a gap, as, again, a negative inherence, a constitutive gap, a kind of inner impossibility. So that's the question. Which one is it, Slavoj Zizek and Jacques Lacan? Is it a kind of psychological excess on the one hand, or is it rather a kind of ontological failure, a type of negativity? This question is important because otherwise we have this paradox. What is it? An excess, a surplus, or is it a kind of negativity, a lack, ontological fault? An ontological incoherence, an ontological failure. Let's end on that point.